Okay, so here is an example. I recorded over the original track so that you can still hear how dry the paper is and how good these bee tubes are. When you pull the bee tubes out, it's nice and dry. There's no holes, and that's what I'm looking for, holes in the black paper, because monodons can actually pierce that paper and lay their eggs with little bees. So if there's no holes, then you're sure there are no contaminated bees. And you go through, this is 2x speed, pulling the tubes out, and of course I didn't have a lot of problems, so they're all good papers without any holes until I got to an example where I did have one, which is a good problem to have. So now this tube is actually a resin bee tube, but you may not know initially from the start that it is resin bees in there, because the mud hole or the mud plug may look exactly identical, but as you can tell, it's a lot harder to break up, and it's a lot stickier, and you can even smell the resin when you open it up. And when it's a resin bee, and you can see how sticky it is on the tweezers, and it's nearly impossible to actually remove the tube when it's a resin bee. So that one's set aside, and then on to the next, where here again we pull a perfectly good paper tube, and when we open it up we see no holes, but one thing we'll see is some pollen balls. Maybe it's the next tube. We'll have some pollen balls that we need to remove, because they can be a source for mold and mildew and fungus and things like that. So this one, we pull it out again, we see no holes in the black paper, and then we'll just, if there are any mites or anything, they should be removed as well. But here we have 2 pollen balls, so we'll just go ahead and remove those and put them in storage. So these are more of the tubes, 3x speed, same issue, just removing pollen balls and maybe some bee larvae that hadn't made a cocoon. And it's pretty great to see how many paper tubes do not have any holes in them, which is always a good thing. And then these black tubes are actually craft paper, and they have certain properties around wicking water, which helps to keep things dry and not moldy, as you can see in these tubes. And in order to do that, it's good to have full sun in the first up to noon, if that's possible, just to make sure these don't get moldy. So these paper tubes are just stored in the fridge with just the black tubes. No need to clean. If there's no mites, no other critters in there, they'll be safe without having to do a lot of extra cleaning of the cocoons. So this is generally the way I've been doing it. I roll my own tubes, and they usually like the black color better. It's more intuitive for them to go into a black tube than a white tube. So here we're going to come into some examples of different issues. So here sometimes the paper gets weak or is wet and it will tear rather than pull out. So you can try to pull it from the other end. And here you can see that little pinprick, that's a monodon that tried to lay an egg inside the cocoon. So you pull that one out, pull that cocoon out, set it aside. It should be watched so that it hatches normally. If it doesn't hatch normally, then you didn't contaminate your whole bee house with more predators. So here's the next tube, and it apparently also has a contaminated one, and everything else, maybe a pollen ball, everything else looks good. So that one looks good. So maybe the pinpricks are not so easy to see on film, but here looks like there's some other materials that need to be pulled out. And the tube. Sometimes the larva dies before making before spinning a cocoon, and they turn black, and they should be removed. So here you can see that pinprick hole in that particular cocoon, so it's good to remove it. Here you can also see some pollen mites, so it's good to remove those. You don't want to put them in storage either. So usually I separate maybe the bee in front and the bee in the back, but if there's not too many bees left in the tube, I'll just remove all the bees and just get rid of the tube with the mites in them. Here's an extra visitor, little spider. Spider made a cocoon in there as well. So it's good to make sure they don't have any mites on the bees, the bee cocoon that you're storing in the fridge. So usually the little mud doors can be removed as they are contaminated, but not the cocoon itself. Here another pinprick hole, and that bee can be separated from the others. Another pollen ball. And maybe some dead larvae in there. So you get the general idea. You can go pretty quickly. Now this hole seems a little larger than the average, so this one looks like there were critters that actually exited the tube. And you can see one of those carpet beetles, whatever they are, still there on the end there, alive. So that's not going in. And some of these other spots that don't look so good. And here's one, one thing is coming out. So here we have, on the end, we just have a bunch of pollen mites. Save that one bee. Get rid of the tube. And sometimes you can just cut off the section if there's a bunch of bees left in the tube that are good. And there's another section of mites. So I take one bee on one side and cut that off. And just save the portion with the good bees. Okay, so this is the pile of good bees that need to go into storage. So you open your container and put the bee tubes within the container, the sealed container. And because the cold, damp air is in the container, it should stay low and not escape too much. And put your loose bees in to the container as well. And they're halfway up the bottom so the carbon dioxide can sink down, and then reseal the box to put it back into the fridge. Here's a better view of the inside of one of those black tubes. Here there's an interesting example of nail-shaped type cocoons, which I'm not sure what they are. And we can see 3 little bee cocoons there. And if we look closely, we can also see some of the critters, other critters that are around. Usually you don't want those around. Here's a better view of those strange cocoons, which break like eggshells. And sometimes the holes need to be identified and plugged with cement for the next year. This is an example of a bee tube that is too moist. You can see it's very wet, and the moisture will be a huge problem. Also, this is looking at the case in the fridge. You can put one of these hygrometers on it so you can see the actual humidity inside the box. Here it's pointing around 60%. Of course, I've opened this one repeatedly by putting new tubes in, so when I change the air out, I can get it higher than 60%. But this you can verify, make sure your bees are not getting too dry. So that's it for the 2022 winter bee cleaning and storage. And another video shows how to maintain the 75% humidity for maximum mason bee survival rate.